Anywho, so we're going to read this. Do the standards of rationality depend on resource context by Eric Sampson. And this is in Acta Analytica. So, here we go. As always, it's my first time reading it. Although I have opinions, they may not be right. Let me know. So drop the music a little bit. Poor people often knowingly and voluntarily act in ways that frustrate the achievement of their own goals. See, right here from the offset is all people act stupidly. Why are you beating up on the poor people? That's just not, like, nice. Like, immediately from the first few words, you're doing something I don't really think is super nice. They prefer not to be poor, and yet they often play the lottery, borrow money at exorbitant interest, fail to take tax incentives intended to help them out of poverty, and so on. None of these behaviors reliably promote their goals, quite the opposite. We usually think that when an agent knowingly and voluntarily frustrates the achievement of their own goals, they are guilty of practical irrationality. Are poor people or resource-scarce agents who knowingly and voluntarily undermine their own interests acting irrationally? Proponents of ideal rationality answer yes, but Jennifer Morton, in a recent award-winning paper, answers no. Morton argues that such behaviors can be and often are rationally permissible when they are permitted by norms of reasoning that typically serve the agent well in her resource-scarce environment. And such short-sighted behaviors, Morton argues, usually do serve those agents' interests. If she is correct, then ideal rationality, which condemns these acts as irrational, is in need of revision. Okay, I mean, basically, look, it's saying we're using heuristics here, things that work most of the time, or at least some of the time, well. They're not meant to work all of the time, and so the idea that we're gonna screw up is you're biting the bullet. You're doing the best you can, given what you know, the amount of time you have to dedicate to your decision making. So that seems like a pretty normal thing for people to do. None of us have infinite time to evaluate all of our options. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so the author says this paper is a defense of ideal rationality. You know, I'm just already pissed off at these people. What do we call this? This is ideal rationality. What's it? The patronizing. Rationality patronizing. Patronizing rationality. What do we think? How do you like my Z there? Patronizing rationality. There we go. That's what we're doing today. We're being patronizing about rationality. Alright, so they begin in section 2 by briefly describing Morton's criticism of ideal rationality and her proposed revision to it. I argue that Morton fails to provide compelling reasons for rejecting it. In sections 3 and 4, I argue that Morton's appeal to social psychological evidence about the behavior of agents in resource-scarce conditions do not support her revision. In section 3, I defend the hypothesis that in many cases resource scarcity causes agents to be rational. Okay, so they're saying it's not that you're using heuristics that work in your resource scarce environment, it's that you're being forced to do dumb things because of your environment, and that is making you use suboptimal strategies which happen to correspond to the heuristics. In section 4, I defend the hypothesis that, in other cases, what appears to be irrational on the part of resource-scarce agents is no such thing, that agents instead experience a reversal of preferences that makes their behavior rational, even by the standards of ideal rationality. In section 5, I argue that Morton's case, ideal rationality relies on empirically dubious assumptions about resource-scarce agents' ability to switch between short and long-term modes of reasoning. If I am correct, then Morton has not provided compelling reason to abandon ideal rationality for her proposed revision. On my view, resource-scarce agents often do act irrationally, and we shouldn't be shy about saying so. We do them no favors by declaring them rational when they undermine their own aims. Indeed, it seems crucial for understanding precisely how to help these agents that we understand the causes of their irrational behavior and seek to intervene in ways that will better help them succeed. Though I think that these agents often act irrationally, this does not imply that we ought to blame them, at least not very much, for their irrational behavior. Since it is significantly more difficult to deliberate correctly in resource-scarce conditions than resource-moderate conditions, we ought to withhold most of the blame that we would ordinarily apply to resource-moderate agents. You know, this is like so patronizing. It's like a little bit wow. Okay. From last philosophy roulette, when we were reading about Simone Weil and how she went and got a factory job and was sort of beaten down by doing factory work, and then you're saying, okay, was Simone, like, are the people that Simone Weil irrational? I feel like Simone Weil would beat this guy over the head when, like, for saying things like that. It's like she would just like take a stick to this dude, because I feel a little bit bad about saying like beating up on this guy, but it's like, I feel like people who are in these positions, yes, are they acting irrationally? It feels like you're adding insult to injury here. They're already in a bad spot, and now you're just calling them crazy. It's like, this is not, like, even if this person has a point, I think they're going about it the wrong way. That said, their setup is nice. It looks like their structure of their paper is well done. They've picked a big target, Morton, who has won awards, and it looks like they're setting up a nice argument to counter Morton's position. So, for all we know, they're going to do a good job, and this might be a nice paper, even if I disagree with how they're going about it and why they're going about it. Okay. And of course, things are going to come down to these definitions: ideal rationality versus ecological rationality. And this is just a hint for everybody. As has been, I've said this before, when you're dealing with philosophers, you have to get them early. They're going to set the definitions, and once they got their setup going, it's just going to keep rolling from there. He's a UNC grad. He should be on his game argumentatively. I do expect so. This is like Acta Analytica. I'm thinking it's going to be like well argued in terms of analytics, analytic philosophy. So yeah, on point. But this is what I mean. This is why I'm bringing up you have to get this person early, right here at the beginning, because like it's literally going to be like right here on like the next few lines where they're setting up their definitions, and what they're going to do is they're going to build in whatever like ideas they want into like the way they formulate these definitions right here, and that's where the rest of the argument's going to flow out of, really. So defenders of ideal rationality endorse something like the following meta-norm. Ideal rationality: an agent A should deliberate using those norms N that A reasonably believes allows her to best achieve her ends E given her cognitive capacities. Alright, so already this doesn't make sense here because you don't know exactly what your cognitive capacities are. How the hell are we to say, alright, I'm stupid and so I'm going to only use these, and if I was smarter I'd use something else? No, everyone just does the best they can. So this is already a very confusing term to me. It's just, you don't need this line, really. Just be like, bah, get rid of that. An agent A should deliberate using the norms that allow her to best achieve her ends. Like, so, whatever, yeah, you should just use whatever norms you think allow, that you reasonably believe allow to best achieve your ends. The cognitive capacities things is just, I have no idea how you're going to understand how dumb you are and how you could, like, choose things based on your smarts. That makes no sense. Anywho. If ideal rationality is correct, it explains why a whole host of behaviors that seem irrational are, in fact, irrational. It explains, for example, why it is irrational in most circumstances to procrastinate, shoot oneself in the foot, refuse to pay one's parking tickets, refuse to take large tax credits requiring minimal paperwork, or to be acrobatic. In each case, the agent fails to do what she reasonably believes would best achieve her ends. In fact, in these cases, she knowingly frustrates the achievement of those ends. Yeah, so it's like if you're supposed to always be the best person you're supposed to be, no, if you're supposed to always act in the way that some theory of rationality, whatever it is, then yeah, if you deviate from that in any way, you obviously are doing the wrong thing. But this is a narrow view of what counts as the best rationality here too. Like, there is only one unique ideal rationality, and as soon as you deviate from it, you've messed up. So I'm sort of, again, what actually counts as the single best thing. Usually, shooting yourself in the foot is bad, except if you're trying to avoid going to war. Maybe shooting yourself is a great idea to avoid the draft. It's like all these things have exceptions. Continuing, Morton rejects ideal rationality because it entails, among other things, that poor people often act irrationally when they knowingly act in ways that promote their short-term goals at the expense of their long-term goals. Yeah, but no one has any fun if you're only doing things for long-term goals. Go have some fun, man. Morton finds his verdict of irrationality implausible and argues that, despite appearances, poor people are usually making no mistake in these cases. On her view, an action is rationally permissible if it proceeds from a mode of reasoning that is appropriate to use in one's usual context. And since the mode of reasoning poor people employ is the kind of short-term focused reasoning that generally serves them best in their resource-scarce context, it is rationally permissible for them to act as they do. This short-term mode of reasoning, Morton argues, is appropriate for resource-scarce agents, even in those supposedly rare cases in which engaging in such reasoning undermines the achievement of that agent's own ends and that agent knows it. In support of review, Morton appeals to recent empirical literature suggesting that being in a resource-scarce environment changes an agent's habits of reasoning such that they become especially good at short-term reasoning but worse at long-term reasoning. She cites the study of 464 sugarcane farmers in 54 villages in rural India whose income varied during the harvest cycle, low income before harvest, high income after. Researchers compared the effects of scarcity on the same farmers' fluid intelligence using Raven's matrices and cognitive control using the Stroop test, before and after the harvest cycle. After controlling for nutrition, stress, and work fatigue, they found that before the harvest, farmers solved fewer Raven's matrices, were slower to solve the Stroop test, and made more errors than they did when tested after the harvest. The researchers conducted a similar study on high and low income shoppers at a New Jersey mall. They primed shoppers with financial concerns before giving the test. Low income shoppers primed to worry about some large expenditure before the test did worse than similarly primed high income shoppers and worse than low and high income shoppers who had not been primed. Even when the researchers offered financial incentives to the primed low-income shoppers, they still performed worse overall. Yeah, so poor people given more stress acted worse than people who were not stressed and then also had more money. So, okay. Stress screws up your reasoning ability. But again, the question is, I don't know what these tests are. Raven's matrices and the Stroop test, I'm sure they're very interesting tests, but exactly what are they solving for? Like, what are they testing? And so, how do we actually know that these are the sorts of things that, like, is it stress or is it being poor? Like, what is it? Is it the financial stress? Exactly what are these tests for? I don't know, and what do they show? I have no idea. Okay. A second set of experiments, however, demonstrated resource scarcity's positive influence on short-term reasoning. Researchers recreated scarcity in the lab by having participants play a game called Angry Blueberries, similar to Angry Birds. So you have a bird, you shoot it at stuff, and you blow stuff up. The participants in the resource moderate group were given more shots than the participants in the resource scarce group. Some participants were also given the option of borrowing from later rounds, while others were not. Participants who were given fewer shots were more efficient per shot from the very first shot than those who were given more shots. Participants in the resource scarce group, however, tended to borrow more than those who had more resources, and often in a way that undermined their own supposed goal of winning the game. The more focused the resource poor were on the current round, the more they neglected and borrowed from future rounds. Okay. Here exactly, right here is where it's going to come down to. The supposed goal of winning the game. If you do not expect to be around in 10 years, who cares if you're borrowing from yourself in 15 years? If you do not care or expect, or you're not really in a position to plan for more than like X amount of years, anything you are borrowing from yourself in X plus 1 years does not exist to you. And so the idea that like you're borrowing against your own future self's interests misses the point that you do not care about that future self if that future self does not exist. If you do not expect to get through the next 5 years, then without borrowing money from your future self, then you at year 6 doesn't matter because you didn't make it that far anyway. And that's like a serious concern. If you don't exist in 6 years, then borrowing from your 6-year future self is actually free money. Free money for you right now. So that's a question. The lesson we should learn from this empirical work, Morton argues, is that resource scarcity affects agents' problem-solving and cognitive control skills in a way that enhances their short-term reasoning, but inhibits their long-term reasoning. In her view, this is no accident. Agents' habits of reasoning conform to this pattern because short-term reasoning best helps them achieve their goals. Alright, so right here, I disagree with Morton. I'm saying they are reasoning perfectly well, but they're reasoning under a different set of goals. Because your set of goals are not to win the game, your goals are to survive, and that's a big difference. So what is the supposed goal here, and are we so sure we understand the goal? You know, I'm not so sure we do. Okay, so I may agree. I think Morton may be right, but for different reasons. Like Morton's right, but for the wrong reasons. I think Morton is right, but for different reasons. And I think the author here, I can already tell I disagree with the authors of this paper. Okay, but the author says if this is correct, it would explain why it is rationally permissible for agents in resource-scarce conditions to reason habitually in ways that prioritize their short-term goals over their long-term goals. And if it is rational for agents to reason in these ways, Morton argues, then it is rational when they act in accord with these norms, even in those cases in which prioritizing short-term goals over long-term goals does not, in fact, help agents best achieve their ends. Again, what is counting as their ends? Thus, Morton endorses what she calls ecological rationality. An agent A should deliberate using those norms and that allows her to reliably achieve her ends E, given her cognitive capacities. Again, a waste of a term here. In those contexts, C, in which she regularly finds herself. Yes, you should use the strategies that work for you. I find this a completely normal thing to say. Like, use the strategies that work for you. If you are using strategies that don't work for you, what are you doing? Now, you can always get better. Like, you can, using the same thing over and over that works for you sometimes, but not all the time. Of course, you have to improve upon that. But you have to use the strategies that work for you. If, like, doing one thing does not work for you, why would you keep doing it? If you did something that does work for you, you keep doing that until you find yourself where it's not working as well. Okay, ecological rationality differs from ideal rationality by maintaining that which mode of reasoning is rational for an agent depends on her resource context. Is that really what this says? Resource context? It's just as what you do what works for you. Ideal rationality, by contrast, is meant to apply to all agents across all resource contexts. Yes, ideal is just completely idealistic. It's for everybody all the time. But ecological rationality is relative. Why? This is relative to the agent. I think that's the takeaway. Okay, continuing. To see clearly how these two views of rationality come apart, consider Morton's case of Herb. Herb is in a debt trap. He borrows money at exorbitant interest month after month. If he claimed a tax credit for which he's eligible, stopped buying lattes, and avoided getting parking tickets, which he could do, he'd be out of debt, and he knows this. He prefers to be out of debt to living as he currently is. Is Herb irrational for buying lattes, not claiming his tax benefit, and not moving his car to avoid parking tickets? Defenders of ideal rationality say yes, this is a textbook case of practical irrationality. Morton says no. Again, this is because the short-sighted mode of reasoning that leads Herb to engage in the behaviors described above usually best serve Herb's interests given his resource-scarce context. This is weird though, because this seems like he's a bit of an idiot. I know people who don't have a lot of money. They generally would, if you want to give them money, like free money, tax credit is free money, they would do it. The reasons people don't claim tax credits is because they have like some sort of barrier to doing so. Like there's too much hassle in getting all the paperwork. They have to get like official documents which don't exist for them because of social problems. Like, and that like it would be really easy for someone who has like a nice easy records. But like say this happened today. I was talking to a guy who's getting married. His wife didn't know her dad. Like there's no paperwork there, and her birth certificate was incomplete. So they go to get the marriage license. They don't want to give them a marriage license because her birth certificate is incomplete and her dad's name is missing, or maybe her name is missing, and she doesn't know her dad. Now, they didn't check. Now he hands in his birth certificate to get the marriage license, and there's no problem. They don't check the dad, so they could literally walk outside, sign anyone's name onto her birth certificate, walk back in, it wouldn't be a problem. But the fact that they had to waste time and money there doing this is probably like, this is the thing. Like, why wouldn't they get married or whatever? Well, because it cost them more time and money than it costs other people who had all their paperwork and ducks in a row because they have like a lawyer. This is the thing. And why is her borrowing money at exorbitant interest month after month? Well, there's probably a reason why someone keeps borrowing money. Maybe he's an idiot. I mean, that does seem like it's really stupid. But like, why would he keep doing it unless he like, does he have a gambling addiction? Like, what the hell? But yeah, it's like, this seems like a very strange thing to try to justify. The reason why people don't claim tax credits is because they have reasons. Sometimes they're terrible reasons, but they're generally reasons. Not like just not doing it because the other reasons that they have are, well, this is what works for me. It's like, yeah, well, then you're not growing as a person. Like, you can still do stuff. Using the heuristics that work most of the time is a good first excuse. If you keep doing it, then it is your fault. All right. So I disagree with everyone on this paper, but that's okay. Just grumpy paper time. Does scarcity lead to irrationality? If Morton is correct that the norms of practical rationality that apply to agents depend on their resource context, then this will require significant change to our standard theory of practical rationality. Is the proposed revision well motivated? Defenders of ideal rationality think not. They think that there are ways of explaining the behaviors of resource-scarce agents in the cases Morton describes that don't require any such revisions. Maybe I agree with the ideal rationality people then. Morton considers several of these hypotheses but rejects them all. In this section, I consider the hypothesis that resource scarcity leads to irrationality. In the next section, I consider the hypothesis that resource scarcity can lead agents to change their preferences from achieving their long-term goals to achieving their short-term goals. I conclude that Morton's rejection of both hypotheses is unjustified. Morton begins her case for ecological rationality by rejecting the hypothesis that scarcity leads to irrationality. A defender of ideal... I think that's right. You should reject the hypothesis that scarcity leads to irrationality. Being poor just leads to being poor. That's basically it. A defender of ideal rationality might explain the behavior of resource-scarce agents in the cases Morton describes by suggesting that being in resource-scarce conditions is likely to cause agents to act irrationally, that is, in ways that undermine the achievement of their own goals. For example, when a large proportion of an agent's cognitive resources are devoted to worrying about where their next meal is going to come from or where they can sleep safely through the night, they have far fewer cognitive resources to devote to careful deliberation. Thus, it is no surprise that they often act in ways that undermine their long-term goals. No one could be expected to deliberate or act as well in these difficult conditions as they would if they had more time and were under less pressure. Yeah, I mean, everyone knows, the more stressed you are, the dumber you are. Like, it makes you. That's completely fair. Morton, however, rejects the hypothesis that scarcity leads to irrationality for two reasons. First, she thinks that ideal rationality should have more to say about the cases she describes, for example, the case of the rural Indian farmers, the angry blueberries experiment. Second, she thinks that when we say that resource-scarce agents often act irrationally, we dismiss their deliberation. Yeah, I think this is fair. Like, people, being poor doesn't make you stupid. Being poor makes you poor and, like, stressed out. And that makes you, yes, have less time to think about things. But that's a question of a time crunch, not that you're not deliberating. Morton says, I think that we should resist accepting that scarcity leads to irrationality before we have considered alternative explanations. At the very least, it is a point in favor of an alternative theory if it has something more to say about these cases. Furthermore, we have an additional reason to resist brandishing the label of irrationality to dismiss the deliberation of people in resource-scarce conditions. Philosophers who write about rationality are, for the most part, fortunate enough not to be in the resource-scarce conditions with which we have been concerned. We have time and resources that allow us to deliberate using norms that align more closely with those sanctioned by our ideal rationality. We should be wary of automatically importing those intuitive assumptions into contexts that are very different from ours. And you got to remember, who's telling you that your rationality is ideal? Is it your theory of ideal rationality? Well, why should you believe that? It's just telling you that it's right. It's like, well, I'm believing this holy book because the book says it's holy. Is that a good reason to think the book is holy? Maybe, maybe not. If your theory of ideal rationality is telling you that it is the ideal rationality, should you believe it? Maybe, maybe not. But why do you actually think that's the right one? Okay. Author says, first, it's not clear why a theory of rationality is required to have anything to say about agents who act irrationally other than they act irrationally. Yeah, that is actually a terrible point. A theory of rationality is supposed to explain what the hell's going on. If people are just acting crazy, and you have nothing to say, then yeah, that would be weird, actually. I completely disagree with this whole entire premise. But the author says, no one thinks that utilitarianism or Kantianism is deficient for not having anything to say about why people fail to maximize utility or fail to conform to their maxims to the categorical imperative. I completely think that they suck when they don't explain why people are failing. The idea that it's just like acrasia and there's some weakness, it just hides it behind some word. It doesn't explain the human condition. That's a complete failing of our theories when we don't explain why people actually act why they do. The idea that we have like a full theory, like a theory like utilitarianism or Kantian deontology that says what you should do is very limited for those theories. But I mean, yeah, maybe you could say, well, they're just keeping to their like their little part of the world. Yes, but wouldn't you like to have a theory of mind that explains all the things or full metaphysics? I mean, yeah, it's like saying, well, they're just staying in their lane. Well, that's great, but then you're making them smaller and smaller. So yeah, I completely criticize like Kantianism for not explaining all the things, and Kant tried to explain a whole host of things. But I think like this person's not giving Kant. They're saying, well, Kant only explained what he wanted, like that like narrow thing. It's like, well, I don't know if that's exactly what Kant was thinking. Kant thought like most of these people thought they were, they're philosophers. They thought they were explaining everything. So no, this is exactly what they said they were explaining. They were saying they were explaining everything, especially like if you're just going with Kantianism and not deontology. I think this might be telling right here. Actually, utilitarianism is up against deontology. Kantianism is up against, well, that's all of Kant. What Kant wrote, like that's not the opposite of utilitarianism, or the opposition to utilitarianism is not Kantianism. It might be virtue ethics, it might be deontology, it might be like Confucianism. It ain't Kantianism, like not even Confucianism, like Confucian ethics. So like this is the thing. The authors here are limiting the scope of Kantianism to exactly what Kant they want it to be. But like, yes, this is the exact problem. If you limit it to what you want it to be, then we are criticizing them for not saying more stuff. No doubt, the adherents of utilitarianism and Kantianism can and do offer such explanations. They appeal to self-interest or acrasia or the power of our inclinations or the fact that people have false moral beliefs or whatever. But these explanations are no part of the normative theories themselves, and no doubt is cast on the moral theories described by these ethical theories simply because they have nothing more to say about the murderers than they act wrongly. Exactly. They are limited in what they say about the human condition. And so you would like more, and I think Kant did say more about people, but not in the moral theory. The same is true of ideal rationality. It is no shortcoming of ideal rationality that it doesn't explain why people often behave irrationally. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we understood that, though? Certainly, defenders of ideal rationality can offer explanations about why people often act irrationally, but that is precisely what we are doing now in suggesting that resource scarcity causes irrationality. The suggestion is that people in resource-scarce conditions deviate from ideal rationality because it is difficult to regularly conform to any norms, for example, moral, legal, or norms of etiquette, when one is living in very difficult conditions that require a large portion of one's cognitive resources. Yeah, again, this is just like so patronistic. Yeah, so being poor causes you to be stupid is what they're saying. That's fine. But I mean, you're not actually suggesting anything here. This is not like, there's nothing that actually, yeah, it's like people make different sorts of decisions under, like when you're poor, you make different decisions than when you have more money. But that should be obvious because everyone makes different decisions based on how much money they have. Now this is like saying, well, I have the ideal rationality, and so mine is better. Fine, but that's not what's going on here. You're just saying they think differently, and theirs is wrong because my ideal rationality is right. So they actually haven't explained anything here. They're again just saying they act wrongly because they have nothing more to say other than they act wrongly compared to what I said. Even though they act differently. They have not explained why they have acted wrongly. They're just saying mine's right. Okay. Second, Morton suggests that we should resist brandishing the label of irrationality to dismiss the deliberation of people in resource-scarce conditions. Here, Morton seems to conflate charges of irrationality and blame. It is one thing to consider a person's behavior, reach the judgment that they knowingly failed to efficiently promote their own ends, and on that basis judge that they acted irrationally. It's quite another thing to blame them. That's fair enough. I mean, yeah, there could be other things going on when, yeah, you could say they made a mistaken judgment, but you don't have to blame them for that. Like, it could be something other at the end. But I mean, I think this is exactly what's going on. I think Morton is right to suggest that because these people are being patronizing, and that is going to blame the poor people for, like, you knew better and you didn't do it, and so it's acrasia. You're saying a weakness of the will. Hey, Evolve Yourself, how's it going? It's going okay. I picked a paper I basically knew I'd be angry at all the things, and I'm angry at all the things, but I'm having a good time just arguing against this, like, paper in front of me. So, I hope you're doing well. Evolve Yourself, for anyone who is watching. People should check out. Evolve Yourself does metaphysics, mind, and philosophy of science. Also does a ton of meditation and other fun stuff like chess on their stream. And so he's a good guy. Yeah. Well, it's like every line is like, nah, I don't really agree with what you're saying here. It's like every line. So, but at least it's not a very long paper. So it's not going terribly. It's going pretty well. But yeah, so Evolve Yourself is good people, I think. He's out in Chicago, making his way. He teaches chess. So one of these days, I want to bug you about maybe having a chess lesson on stream. I have not anytime soon, but like I might ask you about that one day. We'll see. Because I have not actually ever had any real good instruction before. But I have read books in the past. I'll think about it. Yeah, we're not talking like anytime soon. As soon as I get more like time to think about stuff, maybe then, which is God knows when. But it's in the back of my head. Alright, so as per usual, ask me any questions you want as we're going. You can derail me if you like, but here we go. Continuing. Consider the analogy with morality again. An act utilitarian can, and many of them do, hold that there are instances of blameless wrongdoing. For example, I may be a committed utilitarian deliberating about whether to give an enormous sum of money to charity A or charity B correctly conclude that giving to A would do just barely more good than B, but giving to B because my brother sits on the board of charity B. In giving to B rather than A, I knowingly acted wrongly since I knew that giving to B would fail to maximize net utility. But act utilitarians can and likely will hold that I should not be blamed, and indeed that I am not blameworthy, since it is all things considered best to withhold blame. After all, blaming me would likely discourage me from giving charity in the future, and that would result in a net loss in utility. The same is true for adherents of deontological views. If there is a man at the door hoping to murder my friend, I may judge, correctly let's assume, that it is wrong to lie to him about my friend's whereabouts, and yet lie to him anyway. In doing so, I knowingly act wrongly, but deontologists may reasonably conclude that I am not blameworthy, or at least that I deserve very little blame, given the difficulty of my circumstances. If this is correct, then the case of morality if this is correct in the case of morality, then there is no reason to think that the same could not be true of rationality. Summer camp? Wow. Awesome. See, this is weird. This person, the argument here is that, yeah, they're wrong and it's moral, but it's just a little bit of moral badness, and so we're not going to really criticize them. So they're talking out both sides of their mouth. They're saying, well, we're not going to give them blame, and then they say there was no reason it could not be true, given the, well, no, it's this, it's here, very little blame. All right, they're saying very little blame. Like, that is so weird. They're saying we do blame them, but just not a lot. So they wanted to immediately separate out the morality because they were saying that we should resist brandishing the label of irrationality, but then they're saying, well, we're still going to do it just very little. It's like, come on, man. All right. Negative evaluations of rationality, just like negative evaluations of morality, need not entail blame. And even if negative evaluations of rationality do entail blame, they need not entail a significant amount of blame. On the hypothesis that we have under consideration, namely that resource scarcity leads to irrationality, it would indeed make the most sense, at least most of the time, not to blame agents who knowingly undermine the achievement of their own goals as a result of living in difficult conditions. Thus, proponents of ideal rationality can accept the resource-scarce agents often act irrationality without dismissing their deliberation or brandishing the label of irrationality. If so, then Morton hasn't provided compelling reason to reject the straightforward hypothesis that resource scarcity causes irrationality. And if that hypothesis is true, then no revision to ideal rationality is called for. What they're saying here, Rethius, hey Rethius, hope you're doing well, is they're saying basically poor people are acting irrational, but that's not really their fault because it's the poorness that's making them do the thing and not anything else. So it's not they're not really talking about unlawful actions, they're talking about acting against their own interests. So like basically if a poor person does not file for a tax benefit that they should get and that would really help them out, then basically you can call them irrational, even though yeah, well, they're basically, this is see, Rethius, this is exactly the problem here. They're saying basically, no, we're just gonna straight up call them irrational. Yeah, and that's what the other people, and that's what they're arguing against, saying that the desperate logic is irrational. And I'm on the desperate logic side. I'm saying, no, you have not really understood what's going on. You can't just call them irrational because they have this ideal theory of rationality. So I'm with you on this one. Yeah, like just like straight up. I when I started this paper, I don't know if you were here, but I was like, I already know I disagree with them. So I'm like, this is a grumpy paper for me. I'm just gonna make me grumpy and argue the whole thing. What I'm saying here is, this is what these people are doing right here. They're saying, this is the bless your soul. This is the bless your soul crowd. This is the like, we're not going to say that it's like the old, what was it? Like I hate the act, but I don't hate you. Like I'm not blaming you. I'm hating the thing that you did. And it's like, well, you're full of shit because you wouldn't be criticizing, you wouldn't be opening your mouth otherwise. It's like, oh yeah, you did this. You had that relationship with the person I don't like. Well, that's terrible, but like you're okay. I love you, but like I hate your actions. Like this is the two speak. So they just want to say, oh, we're not actually blaming you. We're blaming what you did is terrible, but we're not blaming you. Bless your heart. That's the old phrase. Okay. The scarcity change agents ends. There's another way defenders of ideal rationality might explain the seemingly irrational behavior of resource-scarce agents. They might agree with Morton that agents in resource-scarce contexts do not act irrationally, even when they prioritize their short-term goals over their long-term goals. But that is because resource scarcity causes agents' goals to change. This is what I was saying. I was saying, look, you don't know what these people's goals are, and you're telling them what their goals are, and it's very patronistic. On this view, being in resource-scarce conditions cause a person to care more about her short-term goals than her long-term goals, even if at one time her preferences were reversed. It really depends in the area, Arethius. When I completely disagree with someone, it very rare, like in terms of like professional stuff, it very rarely does anything to like insult them outright. A lot of times using like the principle of charity, if someone has pissed me off like so much that I hate them, like I hate Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think everything Jean-Jacques Rousseau says is wrong. But one of the reasons I'm angry is because Jean-Jacques Rousseau is talking about things I think are important. And so I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau has the right idea about what is important in philosophy. I just hate all of his conclusions. And so if I'm going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I use him as someone as a foil, but I'm not going to sit there and like insult him because, you know, he's providing me with a contrast. If I really think someone is stupid, I don't talk about them. I just don't deal with them because it's not worth my time. The straight up, I hate Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think he's a brilliant philosopher. I just disagree. People I just don't like, I don't waste my time on. That's it. And anyone who's being impolite or being a jerk about the philosophy, then they're just jerks. That's it, all it is. You don't have to open your mouth. You don't have to waste your time. Jordan Peterson, I don't deal with these people online. I just don't. Like, that's not, like, again, those people aren't worth my time. I don't even look at them. I've seen maybe a clip of Jordan Peterson once. And that was not on purpose. I didn't, like, go looking for it. It was someone showed it on something I was watching. Like, that's literally all I've seen of a lot of these people. Yeah, it's like, I don't need to waste my time on dipshits. I just don't. I've got better things to do. Like, I was working on Minesweeper all weekend, hardcore. So, criticized or ignored. I think that's 100% right. If someone is, even if you disagree with someone, but they're worth criticizing, that means they had something worth talking about. If you just ignore someone, that means that they have nothing interesting to say. And that's a worse thing in philosophy. When I was an undergrad, I said something, and one of my teachers says, "You're not even wrong. You're irrelevant." And I was like, nah. he had no filter, that guy, and so he called me like irrelevant. And by the end of the class, I basically asked enough questions, or like I directed the discussion enough to come back to what I had said and showed that it actually was exactly on point. And so, like, you know, he chatted with me after class. Like, I think he might have realized that I was not irrelevant and he didn't know it. But, it's like, yeah. Aristotle. Oh, yeah. Aristotle. Yeah, you asked me once about shit people have said to me. And I had an undergrad teacher once say that people like me shouldn't be philosophers. I should tell you that story one of these days. Anyone who does not know Aris should go check out Aris. He is... the Thoughty for Thought on Twitch. He is probably the best philosophy streamer, or at least maybe not the best, but he's definitely the most attended philosophy streamer at the moment. You mean you go chat around with like 30 people talking philosophy? That's pretty cool. So, nihilism is self-refuting anyway. Yeah, But I mean, it feels good. You'd be like, the people don't realize how good it feels to be so like certain of like nihilism. You'd be like, nothing matters, man. And you can be certain of that, and you can just like wallow in your nihilism. It feels good. Academically, yeah. Well, to be fair, everyone has their own little definitions. So, but like, yeah, nothing matters, and you can go look at what people think matters, and then they say that doesn't matter, and then you get nihilism. I mean, it goes back to Nietzsche, I think, when he said God's dead, and so the thing that gave meaning to all of our lives actually is now removed because we no longer reference God, really, and so that means the current age is nihilistic because we have lost the deep meaning that we used to have. Yeah. Yeah. Well, read chat, read paper, and think about what's going on at once. It's a little complicated. And then there's all the streaming stuff on top of that. Because it came up. Yes, evolve yourself. That's that's better said than what I just did. Let me digress for a second, just because of the things that philosophy teachers have told me before. Yes, one time not even wrong, you're irrelevant. That was a good line by that guy. I think there's another one somewhere else. I can't remember what. Oh, he accused me of plagiarism in the middle of class once. He said you're not smart enough to have written this paper. That guy did. So, yeah, he accused me of plagiarism. Says you're not smart enough to have written the paper. I'm like, I did write this paper. I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, how'd you come up with this? I said it was 3 a.m. and I needed something that would fill up 2 more pages to get to the page limit. So I thought of enough examples, and this is the one that came up with that would fill enough of the space. That's exactly how I came up with this. And he accepted that as an answer. And I went on to take many of his classes. We got along very well after that. Well, we continued to get along. We got along, but then there was a time when I was told that I went... Oh, Aris. Yeah, I'll tell you this story. So there was the time I was told, I got yelled at by a philosophy professor saying people like me shouldn't be philosophers. Now, this guy... I guess, like, I'm sure he's retired by now, because I think he's a good guy. Like, he's a good person. I think he was a good philosopher. I don't actually know if he was a good philosopher, but he might have been. He probably was. He won all sorts of teaching awards. He was loved by the students. He there was like one of those like master classes. Like, he was asked to make a master class, and so he had like a philosophy master class you could buy, so for like lay people to go like learn about his topic. And so he had done one of those, like, because he had won all these awards and people loved him. He was very engaging. And the problem was, this was one of the requirements. And so the way he had his class up was, there were these things he would do that were, like, really engaging for people in the class, but they weren't really good for me. So first of all, you had participation. You had a participation grade. That's fine. Second thing he did, I mean, I don't have any problem with participation in a philosophy course. I mean, you're supposed to do it anyway, and like I was gonna participate, that's fine. Then what he would do is you'd have like these like daily or weekly papers on the reading, so you'd have like these short papers, like it couldn't go over 1 page, and so and then you'd have to like say something about the reading, and so he'd like blow through them and give everyone like a good grade or whatever. But like it was something recent. So then what he would do, actually, what was interesting was we would discuss the daily papers in class, and you were allowed to write stuff on the papers. So you could like add things that other people were saying, and then he'd increase your grade if you added the smart stuff. So I'm sitting in class, and I sit in the back of class. I'm like, this is stupid. I don't like this class. It's blah, blah, blah. But it was a requirement. And I have to, I want to participate in these classes where we're talking about our papers. And when I participate, everyone fucking writes down everything I say. And so, like, that's okay. Like, but like, I see everyone write down my ideas. I'm like, okay, fine. But like, I don't write down any of their ideas. I get no benefit from this, and everyone benefits from like my talking about like good stuff. And this is like every week, like every fucking thing. I'm like, everybody writes down their shit, my shit. I'm like, okay. So I talk to them. I'm like, I don't want to like. I feel like I'm just giving away content here. Like, I'm giving away grades to them, and I get nothing out of it. Because I don't get, like, maybe I get to write something down sometimes, but the rest of the time I don't get to write down anything. So, like, you're curving my grade down is what you're doing. And so he was like, that's interesting. He was like, yeah. So he was like, all right, that's interesting. Like, and then he started to like slightly change how we would talk about stuff in class about how the grading was doing based on like this sort of thing. And then I was like doing other stuff, and I realized I handed in a paper. It was like one of these daily papers, and it wasn't great. It was like, but it was still good enough. Like, I would go in and I say, why did this paper get a B? Like, here's the rubric for like the grading, and it clearly falls into the A category. And he goes to me, well, I expected more of you. I'm like, dude, I'm busy. I fulfill the requirements. I don't have time to like do a bang up job on these like daily papers. Like, this is a lot of time to write a good philosophy paper, even if it's short. I'm like, whatever. So this keeps going on. Like, over the course of the semester, I'm like, you're screwing me out of like an A. I need to get my grade point average up. It meant I did everything to meet the requirements. That wasn't the problem. And eventually, I can't remember which one it was. It might have, I don't remember the order of this thing. It's been a while now. But after a few of these things, where I just kept going in on him, on his, basically his grading schemes, I know how he was, like, screwing me over. It just made him angrier and angrier. And he says, people like you shouldn't be philosophers. I was like, I was thinking you were, and what I said to him afterwards, I was thinking you'd say something like kind of mean like this. I figured, but, like, I have to try. It's like, I got to keep my grade up. So I walk out. Nothing changes in class. He actually does start implementing more things to like account for this. So like after I said you're curving me down because it's me, he says, well, I just do that because I know like you're a philosophy major and you're good. I'm like, that's unfair. You're not me. I met the requirements. He started having everyone write their name on the back of their papers because he realized he was auto curving me. And so that was like a change he implemented mid-semester. He said, everyone, you take your names off of it because I realized I'm curving people unfairly. So like he did start reacting to this, but I pissed him off because I think I really punctured his sense of being this great teacher because his class did not work for me, and I was able to show him that it didn't work, and that made him angry. And he was angry. And the kicker, I say for the end, was he was the classicist Aristotelian philosopher who loved virtue ethics. Yeah. That was ethics. That was my ethics requirement class. Aris. Yeah. So, and I want to say he did apologize a fucking year later. And like I said, I think he was a good guy. Like, he was a good person and all. Like, I didn't have a beef with him as, like, a person. And as far as I know, his philosophy was good, too. So, like, I don't have, like, any real beef with him. And, like, I even considered not telling the story because you could, like, go back and find out who this person was. But I was like, you'd have to put a lot of work in. You could. But you could figure it out who it was. But it's like, if anyone's going to put that much work in, it's just stupid. And like I said, I want to reiterate, he was a good guy. He didn't screw me over in any, like I may have got, like, screwed a little bit. Not a big, nothing worth holding a grudge over. So, anyhow, all right, back to the story. But I did say I was going to tell Aris that story at some point on stream. And it is kind of fun content. I can tell you other weird stories about what philosophers have told me. Yeah, that's absolutely true. You cannot teach for everyone everywhere. It's just not possible. People are too varied. Nothing works for everyone. And so it's a hard job, like, even in the best situation, under best circumstances. Okay, getting back to the paper after the digressions about shit professional philosophers have told me. On this view, being in resource-scarce conditions cause a person to care more about her short-term goals than her long-term goals, even if at one time her preferences were reversed. For example, it seems plausible that agents in resource-scarce conditions care more about buying food than paying off debt or saving for college, even if at one time they cared more about paying off debt and saving for college. But it's also usually not hard to avoid being a jerk, so I'm glad he squashed the beef. I was more of an asshole when I was younger, Aristotle, and so, I probably pissed people off a lot more. So, yes, it's usually not hard to avoid being a jerk, but I used to bring that out of people. I still do. Every so often, I rub someone the wrong way, and it's kind of amazing. Actually, it hasn't happened in like 10 years, but it has happened in the last 15 years, I guess, where... Yeah, I don't know how long ago, where someone just hates my guts. It just happens. And it's part of, I can't make everyone happy. But yeah. Yeah, see, immediately, just like this sort of thing right here, where someone cares more about buying food than paying off debt or saving for college. No. So everyone always cares about buying food. They always cared about buying food more than they did paying off debt or saving for college. If I had to ask you right now, what do you care more about? Starvation or paying off your debts? The answer is always starvation. Always. No one is going to say, oh, I got to pay off my college debt. I mean, yes, I'll starve and die, but I got to pay off my debt. If you do that, you have, lost the game of, life. You've just, succumbed to capitalism and terrible loan people and the banks. That's it. If you do that, you're, this is just straight up wrong. Okay, so if so, then these agents aren't acting irrationally by the standards of ideal rationality when they prioritize their short-term over the long-term goals, so no revision to ideal rationality is called for. That, you just said something that was completely freaking wrong. Aristotle says, there was a guy in my master's program who did that to professors by the middle of one class. The professor was just like, what's it now, Erwin? Whenever he raised his hand, not his name. Yeah. That was me in the ethics class. I would limit myself to 2 minutes of disagreeing with the professor or whatever, and everyone knew I would do it every class, because I would be like, well, isn't this wrong? Why is this the case? But I was like, I would always be like, I'd raise my hand. He knew something I was going to disagree with him, and, that was just it. But I was like, participation grade, man, gotta do it. And why not say something? I did, that was kind of how it was in that class for me. Yeah, I wouldn't do that now. Or I'd do it a lot better now. I wouldn't seem like a jerk about it. Yeah. Yeah, there was something else that happened one of those. Yeah. There's another story about him saying something mean to me. That's okay. Alright, continuing. Morton rejects this hypothesis because she thinks that if we embrace it, we will never be able to attribute irrationality to anyone. She writes, we shouldn't assume that because agents in conditions of scarcity pursue their short-term goals at the expense of their long-term goals, they in fact prefer or value the former. Of course, in some cases that might be true, but we are not warranted in drawing this conclusion merely on the basis of the agent's behavior. If we did, we would be reinterpreting all violations of the instrumental principle as not genuine violations because the agent is in fact doing what she most desires when she acts contrary to her avowed ends. But as Christine Korsgaard argues, this sort of argument leads to an account of irrationality that is not genuinely normative, since no violations of the instrumental principle are even possible. Yeah, so there still is a disagreement here. Even if you are changing your goals, that doesn't mean you are always doing it in a rational way. Aristotle says baby rattlesnakes, man, it's not that their venom is more potent, it's that they don't know how much to use when they're biting, so they inject too much. I feel like philosophy majors are baby rattlers. Yes. Yeah, you drop participation grades for that reason. Yeah, you didn't need the hassle. I mean, completely. But like I said, I think the thing that bit this guy the most was that he had the idea that everyone loved his classes, and for the most part they did. It's true, for the most part they did. One of my professors, actually the one who said I cheated, that I was a plagiarist, he actually used the metaphor. It says, look, you do not use an atomic bomb to kill a cockroach. You have to use the appropriate sort of weapon for the thing. and that's what sort of similar is that you're arguing way too strongly for things that like don't deserve that sort of argument. So, all right. So the authors say that you even like see Morton here is arguing that look, even if like your motivations change and like you're using sort of these heuristics sometimes, you can still be wrong about that, even if it is quite often justified that you're doing what you're doing. But the authors say this is mistaken. We are not bound to interpret all apparent violations of the instrumental principle, that is, the principle according to which we are rationally required to take what we justifiably believe to be the necessary means to achieve our ends, as a mere change in preferences, and thus not irrational. Rather, the suggestion is this: if an agent usually obeys the instrumental principle but violates it on a particular occasion, then we can attribute irrationality to her. If, however, the agent habitually acts in ways that violate the instrumental principle, then it is plausible that the agent's preferences have shifted. If so, then we need not treat all apparent violations of the instrumental principle the same. There is room for us to say that some agents act irrationally, even if some do not, because they experience a reversal of preferences. This is actually fine. Everyone can make space for sometimes their preferences have changed. Sometimes they are acting irrationally. You can't always tell what that is at the outset. That's fine. But both sides get that. Morton also rejects the preference reversal hypothesis because, in her estimation, the empirical evidence doesn't support it. She writes, if we follow this line of argument that agents' behavior is explained by preference reversal, we should conclude, for example, that in the Angry Blueberry or Family Feud experiment, the resource-scarce participants experience a preference reversal such that they prefer to do well at each shot or turn more than they prefer to win the game overall. This is counterintuitive. Actually, I think Morton, this is where I disagree with Morton. I agree. They do want to win earlier depending on stuff. The thing is really that it's a risk-reward thing. You have to risk more earlier, and so you have to prefer to do well at each shot and potentially lose sooner, but you really have to do well at each shot in order to try to win. And so the winning, in some sense, is after the fact. You're getting most of your pleasure out of giving yourself a really good opportunity to win. And then winning the overall winning the game might actually not feel as good as winning as scoring really high early because you need to. So I'm not even sure if this is entirely counterintuitive. But it's not the authors say, but it's not counterintuitive at all. If participants in the very artificial lab experiment can see that they haven't been given enough shots to win Angry Blueberries, as the resource-scarce agents were not, then it's perfectly reasonable for participants to respond as follows. Well, I guess I can't win this thing. I guess I'll just do my best this round. Yeah, I agree with them in this way. This is true of see, here's the problem. You can't actually tell. They could be doing one or the other. But that's the problem here. You can't actually say one or the other. You can't claim that they're ideal or if they're just relativizing. The same is true of the Family Feud game. If you haven't been given enough time to answer all the questions asked of you, then upon realizing this, it makes perfect sense to say, well, I can't possibly win this thing. I guess I'll just do my best to answer the question being asked of me right now. If this is correct, then there is nothing counterintuitive about suggesting that participants' preferences for winning the game over doing well in a particular round changed upon discovering that they couldn't possibly win the game. Thus, Morton hasn't provided compelling reason to reject the preference reversal hypothesis either. She therefore hasn't provided compelling reason to abandon the ideal rationality. Yeah, I agree with the authors here. She didn't maybe knock down all of ideal rationality's defenses here. The problem is, ideal rationality is just patronistic and jerk-faced, and so these people don't have to believe her, but they shouldn't have been ideal rational. They shouldn't have their preference. They shouldn't be ideal rationality theorists to begin with. So if you're already there, this is not the best of ways to argue against them. It may be a reason to think that, but again, this was not a knockdown argument. I think what Morton was doing in this case was just building up various objections. They aren't all knocked down. And so what's going on here is that the authors here are saying, well, this sub-point of yours isn't right and we don't have to believe that. It's yes, but that wasn't Morton's strategy. Morton's strategy was to give a bunch of different reasons why you should abandon ideal rationality. And this wasn't the major one, and so knocking it down that's okay. Okay, if what the author has argued in the section and the previous one is correct, then Morton fails to provide sufficient reason to reject the alternative hypothesis about why resource-scarce agents often violate or appear to violate ideal rationality. But it's worth noting that even if Morton did succeed in showing that each hypothesis on its own does not fully explain resource-scarce agents' behavior, that would not show that the two hypotheses do not jointly explain their behavior. Morton does not even attempt to show that the various explanations she considers could not be combined to fully explain the phenomenon at issue. Thus, Morton fails to demonstrate that ideal rationality has some deep flaw that would justify making her proposed revisions. Yes, I think that's right. You're probably going to have a mixed approach. No one thing works. Now, the question is relativized rationality to your situation, like being poor or, resource scarce, as they say. Is that going to explain everything? Probably not. That's fine. But, this is a nitpicky thing, in my opinion. They didn't explain everything, but you know what you just said up here about Kant and utilitarianism? They don't explain everything every time. And you said that was okay for them. Why isn't it okay for Morton? This is the problem. This argumentation here in this structure is saying, well, look, they didn't do a knockdown, drag-out argument. But just above, they said you didn't have to either. Now, that's fair. They can maintain their spot. Most intelligent philosophers can maintain their position, even against a very strong attack. It very rarely is anything completely knockout blow. That's fair. But you have to consider, do you think the weight of what Morton says actually work? And like I said, I think I disagree I think Morton's right for the wrong reasons, and I think these people are jerk faces for being patronizing. So, can agents switch between short-term and long-term reasoning? Morton is interested in defending ecological rationality because it supports the claim that resource-scarce agents are not irrational when they knowingly undermine the achievement of their own aims. Herb's case is central to Morton's case for supporting this conclusion, but does Herb's case really support that conclusion? In this section, I argue that it doesn't, since the Herb case rests on empirically dubious assumptions about resource-scarce agents' ability to switch between short-term and long-term modes of reasoning. You know what? I think they're probably right. I didn't like that case earlier, and we can go back to it if anyone has questions. But basically, Herb is just not doing anything to help his position. He didn't file a tax benefit that he could for whatever reason. Like I said, maybe in the first instance, when you have been in a situation where you have been doing one thing that's been working for you, but all of a sudden it's not working for you in this case, you could say, look, they were ecologically rational the first time, but then if it continues to fail for you, that also means you didn't learn anything from your mistakes. And then even then you should switch up your strategy at that point when you have continued to fail. Morton argues that even though Herb prefers being out of debt to having a latte, and even though Herb knows that he could get out of debt in part by not buying the latte, nevertheless, Herb is not irrational for buying it. And see, this is the other part of this. These people are jerks. They're playing into the millennials just don't have anything because they're spending all of their money on coffee. Of all the damn crappy examples you're going to use, stop making fun of using this terrible trope that somehow it's the coffee that is making people poor. Screw you. Give people their little bit of happiness during the day. Morton agrees that Herb is knowingly undermining the achievement of his own goals. She agrees that it would be better if Herb did not buy the latte. But she denies that he is irrational again because Herb's short-term mode of reasoning usually serves him well, and his decision to buy the latte is licensed by his usual short-term mode of reasoning. Yeah, see, this is the thing. If the short-term reasoning is usually working, that's good. But if you keep doing that and you're not getting to any of your larger goals, then you should switch it up. So I would be I agree with Morton in the short term. In the first few instances, this could be the case. But people aren't stupid. They should realize that there are better things that they could be doing eventually. But they have to experience that first. They have to find out what they should be doing. But why should it matter that Herb's short-term mode of reasoning usually serves him well? Shouldn't Herb be able to see now that acting according with his usual norms of reasoning will lead him to undermine his own goals? This is what I say. And if so, isn't knowingly undermining one's own goals sufficient for rationality? That's if he does it forever. That's not the example, though. You don't have enough information. And so these authors here are putting more into the example than it existed before. It only told us about like one or that this happened, not that it's going on for 10 years. Morton suggests that switching from the usual short-term mode of reasoning to long-term reasoning on a particular occasion is not open to Herb or resource-scarce agents more generally. Well, Herb would have to be in a really bad spot that he can't ever change. I mean, that's unusual. That's kind of weird. Since norms of practical reasoning are neither transparent to us nor up for revision on a regular basis, they run in the background as it were, Herb cannot simply abandon his usual mode of short-term reasoning for the clearly better long-term mode of reasoning appropriate for his current situation. And since ecological rationality says that an agent ought to use the norms of reasoning that best promote her ends in the context and given her cognitive capacities, Herb makes no rational mistake when he fails to switch to long-term reasoning in his current context. Thus, crucial to Morton's case for her distinctive view is the following empirical claim. No switching. It is extraordinarily difficult for agents to switch from short-term to long-term reasoning or vice versa on a particular occasion when doing so would best promote their own ends. Here is the statement given her cognitive capacities again. No one has a goddamn understanding of what this freaking sentence means. What does this mean given your cognitive capacities? It means nothing. It just means in the situation you are in. That's it. Cognitive means nothing. It just means, okay, you're in this situation. What else does it mean? Now, here's the real question. If you are in this situation, then you do not have the resources to reach for long-term reasoning. They do not exist to you. The idea that you can switch from short-term reasoning, which is the only reasoning available to you, to long-term reasoning, which you cannot physically do given your situation, given your cognitive capacity, you can't switch because there is no option to switch to. And so in that case, by definition, Morton is right. There is no switching. Because there is no switching, anything to switch to. The ideal people here in this paper are assuming the de facto default of ideal rationality, that it exists. It does not exist for people that it is outside of their mind because they cannot think that way. And so, again, these people have, this is what I was saying about the definitions. They are defining the existence of ideal rationality here. They're granting it. And so if you do not grant it, then the no switching makes perfect sense. But they have begged the question here. Because they're saying that you always have the option to switch. You might not. You might be in that bad of a spot. Granted, I wouldn't say you're in that bad a spot over a long period of time. That's just unlikely. But again, in the short term, then I have to agree with Morton. What support does Morton offer for no switching? The support is the empirical data suggesting that resource-scarce agents very often act in ways that prioritize their short-term over their long-term goals. Again, are we imposing the long-term goals on them, or do they actually have the ability to reason that way? People say they have certain goals, but people say a lot of shit. They may not have actually ever thought about it. Yes, this is the part of the paper. Even though they are trying to say, oh no, we're not like being patronizing, it kind of reeks of being patronizing here. Yeah, just be smart like us. Exactly, Valpo. They should just change what they're doing. Obviously. Morton suggesting that these agents regularly promote their short-term goals to the neglect of their long-term goals because their context makes short-term reasoning their best policy. It's their best policy because it's their only policy. It's the only one that exists when you're like that screwed up. And it is extraordinarily difficult for them to switch from short-term to long-term reasoning when doing so would best promote their ends. But this data offers only minimal support for no switching, since it's compatible with the claim that often enough, resource-scarce agents do act in ways that prioritize their long-term over their short-term goals, and it's plausible that, as a matter of fact, resource-scarce agents often do prioritize their long-term over their short-term goals when doing so best promotes their ends, even if their habitual mode of reasoning prioritizes their short-term goals. Again, they're defining. These people are saying what their ends actually are. So this is just, again, this is just the structure of what these people are saying is building in the existence of ideal rationality. It may not exist for certain people, or it may not exist in the same way. For example, most resource-scarce agents don't abuse very pleasurable but highly addictive illegal drugs or sell illegal drugs, which is known to be very profitable, or shoplift on a regular basis, or engage in violence against their enemies or rivals, and so on. Each of these behaviors is often highly beneficial in the short term, but destructive in the long term. Certainly some resource-scarce agents engage in these behaviors on a regular basis, and perhaps the proportion of resource-scarce agents who engage in these behaviors is higher than the proportion of resource-moderate agents who do so. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of resource-scarce agents do not engage in these behaviors. Why not? Oh God, what is wrong with these authors? Here's one hypothesis. Even if these agents have a habit of prioritizing their short-term over their long-term goals, they can see as clearly as any resource-moderate agent can that these behaviors are very bad for them in the long run. Thus, they refrain from engaging in these behaviors. If this is true, then resource-scarce agents very often, as they're faced with the opportunity to engage in these short-sighted behaviors, switch from short-term to long-term reasoning. See, this Manichaeanism is so crazy. The idea that, like, oh, they're thinking about the future when they don't do drugs right now. Is that really why? Maybe they had it beaten out of them when they were a kid that they shouldn't do drugs. There could be a million reasons why people do drugs or don't do drugs. Why are you assuming that they're like, oh, my future will be in danger if I take this hit right now? Really? You think that's what people are thinking? Thus, no switching is false. Maybe what they're saying is right, but like maybe not. There's a lot of reasons why people do this stuff. It's not so simple to switch from short-term to long-term reasoning. It is not extraordinarily difficult for resource-scarce agents to switch from their habitual short-term mode of reasoning to long-term reasoning. They do it all the time. And Valpo, this is exactly what he said. Just do it, man. It's easy. Why don't you just think about this other stuff? Clearly. If this much is correct, and it isn't, according to me, then it is appropriate to accuse Herb of irrationality when he knowingly fails to prioritize his long-term goals, which are more important to him over short-term goals. After all, he could easily switch to long-term reasoning and refrain from buying the latte. And that is true of resource-scarce people more generally. Yeah, poor people are just poor because they're being stupid. That's exactly what's happening here. Again, whether we ought to blame Herb and similar agents in these cases is a separate question. It is compatible with everything I've said that Herb and similar agents deserve no blame whatsoever, or very little blame. Yeah, again, they're crazy, but it's not their fault. I mean, how patronizing are we going to get here? It's just like, oh, no, it's all just like, oh my God. I mean, even if at least if they blamed Herb for being stupid and like doing something irrational, that would at least give Herb agency. They're not even giving Herb agency when you're poor. It's like, come on. It's like something. If what I've argued in this section is correct, the Herb case does not support the claim that resource-scarce agents are not guilty of irrationality when they knowingly undermine their own aims. Ecological rationality supports the claim only if it's very difficult for agents to switch between short-term and long-term reasoning. But I've argued that empirical claim is false. It's not difficult for resource-scarce agents to switch modes of reasoning in this way. They do it all the time. Conclusion. I've argued that Borton's arguments for abandoning ideal rationality in favor of ecological rationality fail on both empirical and philosophical grounds. I'll conclude with the political upshot of embracing ideal rationality, as I've suggested we should. Morton argues that, if her view is correct, government agencies who hope to help poor people out of poverty ought to redesign their incentives and penalties so that resource-scarce agents can rationally respond to them. But this point can be accommodated by defenders of ideal rationality. If we know the ways that resource-scarce agents regularly act irrationally and why they do so, then government agencies can design their incentives to account for this fact, either by exploiting predictable failures of rationality to benefit resource-scarce agents, or at least by not offering incentives and penalties that will reliably be ignored by them because of resource scarcity-induced irrationality. Which of these is preferable will depend on one's more general views about the ethics of paternalism and nudging. In any case, it is not as though those hoping to benefit poor people must accept Morton's view in order to do so. Okay. This conclusion here, it's like, yes, the people of ideal that are defenders of ideal rationality can use this stuff, like the idea that how people are being irrational, to say, well, we can fix that because we can, get them to respond in those ways if that's how they are acting. But it's funny because it's not being irrational, it's acting in a different sort of way. They're calling it irrational, but it's still regular if there is a way that they could analyze it. And so this is funny because they're saying, look, they're acting irrationally, but this is a very consistent way of how they're acting, and so we can do it. And so we can still design programs for them. So it's a very strange definition of irrationality that they have now. Aristotle says the example might work in the abstract sense, but it's really divorced from how people actually think. Yeah. Though that's the problem. This feels like ivory tower bullshit. Like, very strange. Like, this is just very strange in some sense. The whole thing. It's like, I understand the motivation to want this ideal rationality. I get it. You think like there's one rationality, what it is to be human has like a rational component, and there's only like one of them. Like, there's only one thing to be rational. Like, what do you mean multiple rationalities? I have to be able to understand what you understand, and that's what it is to be human. We understand each other. That's what it is to be rational in some sense. And so there should be one way to do this. But that might be way too simplistic in the last analysis. That's what I feel. It's like that's a little bit simplistic, that sort of prevents growth, because that means you're talking about one rationality, but that means that even like everyone is exactly the same in some sense, and that's not true. Aristotle says rationality here is applying to lots of different beliefs and desires here, and both things have different psychological standards. Yeah. Aristotle says emotions and desires can be a mess, and while it won't feel good, it's certainly not contradictory. Rationality or cognition, though, if it has outright contradictions, is going to lead to huge problems. Yeah, that's a good point, because if you're going to just take the line that, well, your logic has to be at least of a certain kind, that's fine. Like, you have to be able to talk logic with other people, and they have to understand it as logic usually. That's like a standard of logic. But that's a very, very weak standard when it comes to rationality, because just having a logical agreement is not going to get what they want or need here for rationality, which is decision making, which is a completely different thing. It's gonna have to use logic sometimes, but so does everything else. Like, decision making in like real life is not going to merely be governed by the laws of logic. Aristotle says, like, Herb isn't denying that if he saved more money that he could pay off debt. He's just denying that overall it's worth him to do that. Yeah, and that's the thing. I think they're discounting how powerful short-term reasoning can be, especially, and I said this early, I don't know if everyone was here at that time, especially if you have no guarantee that the long-term stuff has any chance of ever playing out. If you don't actually, like, yes, it would be good to pay off my long-term debt, but if you think, like, society is going to crash in 10 years, what do you care about paying off your debt? Like, if you think it's more likely that, like, there won't be any banks in 10 years, why do I could take out a 30-year loan, have no intention of paying it back, and never have to pay it back because the banks are all closed in 10 years. So, this is, and if everyone you've ever known is in debt, you can survive in that system. Exactly. These examples are strange, especially the latte one. It feels like U.S. political talking points, which is strange. This doesn't account for really radical sorts of like short-term thinking, and which I tried to mention. Where was that? Where that last thing, the switching thing, the no switching. It may be even worse than extraordinarily difficult for agents to switch from short-term to long-term reasoning, because if you're in such a bad way that you might not have long-term reasoning available to you, so it doesn't exist. So it's not that it's difficult, it's that it's metaphysically impossible. Now, that case should only last a short amount of time. You'd have to be under massive stress. But that's actually okay for the Morton's view. Like, generally, if you have, over time, you should have more time to think about stuff. Of course, not everyone's going to. Say you're like slave labor or something. Maybe you don't have time to do it. But whatever. And, yeah, these examples. Like, if the debt example, the latte example. Like, this is not understanding what it is to be poor. Valpo says he's affiliated with the Georgetown Market Center, so it's not surprising that his politics are of a certain sort. Interesting. So, yeah, this might have a economic sort of background, and some of those crew are looking at things in a certain way. Yeah, that's super interesting. But yeah, that actually brings up an interesting point. Like, this is the sort of thing that, a think tank might have someone on staff that would write papers like this. And if you look at this, would you think that Ideal Rationality is pushing a political agenda? Maybe not, but like, that's exactly what happens in the end. They talk about political agendas right here. Like, what would you do? And so this is how, like, and I don't hate the idea of having political agendas or like conservative ideas built into philosophy like this, because Ideal Rationality is kind of like this conservative thing that there is a concept of rationality that should be conserved, that should be protected because it's important, and that's like a big philosophical idea. Like, that's not a terrible position to take, but like you see how it's also getting pushed into a social theory here, and that's interesting. So any further comments? I mean, this is just a sort of thing that gets me on a few levels. Like, the reasoning on the surface seems good, but then there were a few times where they were just dead wrong. And it's hard to spot if you're not looking for it. Really hard to spot. Like, I pointed out where they lumped Kantianism and utilitarianism together because they just wanted to talk about ethical theories, but it turned out that what they were doing was they were trying to keep people in their lane, and then as soon as they said that, then they accused the Morton of not doing that, but they didn't grant Morton the same thing that they just said you could do for utilitarianism or Kantianism, and they didn't mean Kantianism here, they meant deontology. And so this shift, they had some really, really subtle like just contradictions or just mistakes that even in a really good journal like Acta Analytica, in an analytic journal, they're still making like these subtle like mistakes in definitions and their argumentation. So, and it was all in favor of their point. So it is well argued, but like sneaky argued. Maybe not. Some of the mistakes were just mistakes, but like it's pretty like, this is a good paper. It's a good paper. I just completely disagree with it. And if you want to pick it apart, you can. But again, you can pick apart basically everything if you want to. So.